Hi everyone, welcome to this third response video that I'm giving to some of the questions that you've asked about this week, European migration, particularly the externalization of immigration policy, of migration policy by the EU and by states within the EU. I've got a few of your questions that I've collected, and three in particular, although they're all based actually on one. I try to go with the most popular ones. And the more popular ones are based on almost the same quote actually this week, but slightly different questions. And so I think the questions will give us a chance to cover a few of the specific issues, of the specific concepts that are covered in this week's theoretical reading. And now, let me say, before I get into the questions, let me do a little bit of housekeeping. And it's this, I do have something to say, that I took points off a lot of you this week, week 3, for your perspective questions. I mentioned already on one of the videos that if we were not focusing on the theoretical question, then points would be removed. And I got to week 3 and I haven't really been enforcing it. Sort of giving you the chance to sort of see that first week's video and also to look at the syllabus. But since for some of you that haven't got your attention, I figured that's the best thing I can do right now. I mean, that is how I intend to grade. That is how I intend to grade going forward. I won't go backwards to week 1 and 2. As I said, I sort of give you those 2 weeks to find it out, right? Either from listening to the video or from looking at the syllabus. But I noticed that a lot of questions weren't focused on. Now, it's not just the distinction between the theoretical pieces and the journalistic pieces. It's not just sort of an arbitrary thing. The point of the class really is for you to see and to encounter and to deal with and to discuss with me some theoretical approaches to some of the main issues that are going on in the world. So the journalistic articles, again, they're up there for sort of establish the issue, to establish the particular issue that we're discussing. But really what I want you to focus on is the theoretical or political science. What does political science have to say? What does it have to offer us as we consider these things like European migration? So, and the thing that I think it has, one of the many things, but the thing that I chose to discuss with you this week is this idea of externalization of border policy, of migration policy, gatekeeping, fencing, what that means, what's the difference between them, so that's why I'd like you to focus your perspective questions going forward. Have a look in the modules. You'll see, you see the readings there, and they're marked as to whether I'm saying that they're a theoretical reading, as one each week is, or whether it's a journalistic reading. Again, check out the syllabus under the perspective question for sort of clarification, I suppose, in what I'm saying, or listen to what I'm saying here, which you're already doing, or go back to that first video that I did, where at the very beginning of that video, not the very beginning, it's the second thing that I discussed, but I mentioned it there and talk about, sort of grades being connected to you doing those questions based on the theoretical argument. So with that said, I just be careful of that moving forward. It impacted your grade this week, and it will impact your grade as well throughout the rest of the course. If on the off chance, and this is entirely possible, if I did take points away from you, and you'll see I've almost always made a note, I've intended to always make a note, I've made a note on your grade, so you can sort of see that's the reason why you lost the points. You'll have lost 10 of the 20 points, right? The step 1 and step 2, you'll have lost the step 1. So 50% of the points for this week's perspective question. If some of the questions actually were fine questions, but since they weren't focused on the theoretical question, so if you do notice that, that's why. Though, and this is why I'm saying this again, but if you see that actually, hey, I did base it on the theoretical, it's entirely possible that I could have made a mistake. So do email me and let me know that, and I will check that and correct it. And again, please, going forward, base your question, and also please don't upvote a question that you can see is not based on the theoretical one. And so in selecting my questions, I like to just take the top, right, the most popular ones. But this week, actually, the most popular ones were ones that were not based on the theoretical reading. So I've sort of dug down a little bit deeper into the list, and I found these. So this first question here, it's 23 upvotes. It was quite highly ranked and clearly based on the theoretical reading. And it goes like this. The quote is this. It says, gatekeeping policies aim at restricting practical legal access to a nation and its institutions, while fencing measures actively target illegal migrants in order to arrest and expel them. That's the quote. I do want to talk a little bit about just sort of re-emphasize the distinction between gatekeeping policies on the one hand and fencing measures on the other. It does come up in the question later on, and so it'll be useful. When Triandafylidou is, when she's writing this article, when she's explaining externalization of EU migration policies, she mentions two sets of policies, right? One is the gatekeeping policies and the other is the fencing policies. And in fact, the explanations in the quote there about the difference between them. She distinguishes between them because she actually, later on in the article, of course, makes the distinction about which ones work and which ones don't, and which ones have worked, which type of policies worked in certain situations with certain countries, in certain partnerships between EU countries and third non-EU countries, which is a big part of the reading, right? This is another sort of concept to take away from the reading, right? It's the partnerships and the sort of, the collaborations that are going on between countries that are receiving migrants, countries that migrants are trying to get to in the EU, like Spain and France and Italy, especially in the beginning, and certainly Germany, Britain, who are not mentioned as much, Sweden, who are not mentioned as much in the article, but who are oftentimes destinations for migrants. So the partnerships between those guys and places where migrants either come from or through which they travel on the way to there, and that's an interesting concept as well, because, well, I'm getting too far ahead of myself, right? I'm getting too excited, but so let's wait there a second. So these partnerships are a focus or a concept that I want you to take away from this. And the partnerships involve two types of policy cooperation: one gatekeeping, one fencing. And gatekeeping policies, I think, is the one that Triandafylidou thinks that have been somewhat successful between Italy and Libya, and then Italy and Tunisia. And that and gatekeeping policies are associated, as it says there, with migrants who are trying to do this legally. We're turning up at the border, we're presenting ourselves at the border and asking for entry, right? For asylum, perhaps, certainly for entry. And so gatekeeping policies are aimed at restricting access, legal access, right, through those borders. And then fencing measures are aimed at irregular migrants who are not showing themselves at the border, migrants who are trying to enter the country another way, and sort of skirt any sort of detection or any sort of encounter with official state officials, right? So that's the distinction between them. So in the reading, right, we hear of patrols, marine patrols off the coast of these islands, south of these islands, between Africa and Europe, in the Mediterranean, or in the case of Greece, in the Eastern Aegean. We have patrols there in the water that are trying to detect migrants coming over on boats. That might be a fencing policy, right? Because depending, I suppose, I suppose we don't know this, right, at the time, but depending on where they're headed, right? Are they headed for a proper border crossing, or are they trying to get somewhere else down in there, to evade detection? That's fencing, and then gatekeeping policies is trying to prevent through the use of papers, show us your papers type restrictions. All right, so The question goes on like this. I know this article is about European migration, but I cannot help but wonder what author Anna Triandafylidou's perspective on American immigration policy would be. Later on the same page, the author discusses how the externalization of EU migration and asylum policies prioritizes control and efficiency over fundamental rights and the right to asylum. Right, one of the things of externalizing policy, right, is that asylum rights sort of begin when you end up at the border. Right? I think I might have discussed this in my introduction video. Asylum rights begin when you present yourself at the border and claim asylum. And this is absolutely, as the questioner here alludes to it, this is absolutely an issue that we've been also encountering here in the United States. That if you can't show up at the border, right, if we've had an externalization of our migration policy, perhaps in the United States case into Mexico, where we've done some sort of deal with Mexico, we have some sort of cooperation, some sort of understanding with Mexico, that they will handle asylum applicants that maybe were not trying to apply for asylum in Mexico, maybe intended to apply in the United States. But because, but if we've enlisted and if we've co-opted the Mexican government to handle and to process those sorts of claims first, then that really prevents migrants then from ever showing up at the border, from ever presenting themselves. And so perhaps as a way of restricting practical legal access to a nation. Legal access to a nation and its institutions. Okay. Later on the same page, okay, EU prioritizes the right to asylum, right, which is enshrined in international law. While pointing out that liberal democratic states have always cared more about civil liberties than rejecting unwanted migrants. With all of this in mind, my question would be for Triandafylidou directly. To what extent do you consider the United States concerned with immigration policy in comparison to that of the EU? That's a great question, I think, which really I think broadens the scope of the article. Of course, particularly if you look at the title of the journal that she's publishing this in, right? It's about islands. So clearly, the island dimension is mostly an EU sort of specific to the EU, right? But certainly the externalization of migration policy isn't, and can absolutely be applied to the United States. And I don't know as much about this, to be honest, in terms of the details of the agreements that the United States has with Mexico, but just from looking at the news, right, and from sort of following it fairly casually, there does seem to be some sort of pressure, carrots and sticks, right, that the United States is currently exercising with the Mexican government in order to slow down migration, in order to impede people from presenting themselves at the southern border in the US. So absolutely. Do you believe that the USA is a more of a gatekeeping or a fencing nation? And I think that, you know, having discussed and sort of mentioned the distinction between gatekeeping and fencing, certainly the United States and probably many others employ both sets of policies, right? Both trying to arrest and expel irregular migrants who haven't presented themselves at the border, and also those that do present themselves at the border, trying to process them in a way that you know, probably ends up reducing the number that they take. Okay. Does the United States care more about civil liberties or rejecting unwanted migrants? Right? How would the USA compare to the EU with respect to the aforementioned questions? And I think you know, we mentioned sort of the islands, and have another look at the reading and see, is there anything specific about the islands? Is there anything special about the islands, about the geography of the place? Right, in terms of water crossings versus land crossings. She does talk a little bit about that when she talks about Greece. And certainly one of the things that she says is that, you know, between Greece and Turkey, when migrants are coming from Turkey to Greece, not many of them are coming across the land border, right? There is a land border between Greece and Turkey. Is it 95% that are coming to the Aegean Islands, I think she says. 95%. So the vast majority of them are coming over the sea. Not much of a sea there between the Aegean Islands that belong to Greece and Turkey. Very, very narrow, but also quite treacherous waters there. What role does that play? She talks a lot about sort of marine patrols, coordination in international waters in the high seas. She says, and cooperation between like Italy and Spain, south of Malta, and also Malta in Italy, right? Although that doesn't seem to be going very well, according to what she's saying. So cooperation between nations, which might be certainly the geography seems different if we're thinking just of the southern border. Of course, from Cuba to Florida, I don't know. I haven't heard a lot recently about that route, that migration route. I don't know if it's how active that is. Certainly, most of the attention and most of the things that I've heard of concern the land border. So there's a geographic difference here, and also geographic in the sense of how many countries are cooperating in sort of keeping out the migrants or keeping them out, right? Trying to find them coming over in the boats and things. It does seem to be sort of just a sort of the concern of the United States of America. Part of that is geography. Part of it is still geography, right? But where are the destinations, right? In the Western Hemisphere, migrants, at least as it's usually discussed, irregular migrants, right? Asylum seekers, right? They're coming from oftentimes Central America, overland, and then they're not, usually Mexico, for example, is not their first destination. Well, it's their first destination, but it's maybe not their where they want to get, right? Of course, they want to get to the United States, right? Which is a much wealthier, safer, better prospect, right? For and actually, I suppose in that sense, we can say similar things about the EU in this way. It's a slightly different way, and this is the comparison, really. How would the USA compare with the EU with respect to some of those aforementioned questions? And this is alluded to, I think, in some of the journalistic articles. Migrants who are coming to the EU are oftentimes not interested in settling. Their main destination, their ultimate destination is usually not Greece. It's even usually not Spain and Italy. Usually where they want to go, where there's sort of certainly much more economic options and sometimes more family members, right, is Germany and then Sweden, and then also France. And maybe Britain, but Britain is more of a difficult prospect. But, there are people that do try to migrate to Britain irregularly or as asylum seekers, but you've already sort of gone through the whole of Europe at that point, and now you've got to get over and they're not in the Schengen area, right? So it's there are border controls once you get to Britain. So there is also that similarity that you're coming through sort of Greece and Italy in order to get somewhere else, right? And in that respect, and I think I was saving this for later, but in that respect, there's some interesting similarities and distinctions, right? In this way, like, who is the United States in this comparison, right? So if we agree that many migrants from Central America are not ultimately interested in settling in Mexico, they're actually interested in getting further north, right, to California, right, or to Texas, or to Arizona, for that matter. So they're going to pass through Mexico. Now Mexico becomes a transit country, right, a pass-through country, and as such, right, the issues that they will deal with as a country, the issue that their state officials will deal with will be different, right? It will be different from a final destination country. And so, in this sense, we can say, okay, well, maybe Greece is Mexico in this situation, right? And ultimately, they want to get to, let's say, Germany, right? That's a popular destination. So they want to get to Germany, and they're just going to transit through Greece. Now, Greece. So So we could maybe say that. And what that means, I suppose, right, is that already, and Triandafylidou says this at the end of her piece, but already then Greece is already Germany's immigration policy, migration policies already externalized, right? It's externalized to Greece, right, or to Italy perhaps, right, or to Greece and Italy are the two main countries, maybe to Spain as well, and then similarly Britain as well, right? Of course, until recently, right, also a member of the EU that's externalized its migration policy quite far from its borders. But again, Britain's a special case because it's not in Schengen. But also Schengen, which I should just point out, because it's not, I don't think it's, well, I think it is in the reading, but the Schengen agreement is that once you're inside of a Schengen country, which is a lot of the EU countries, but not all of them, not Britain, for example, which is obviously no longer an EU country either, but was never a member of the Schengen agreement either. And there's other European countries that are not, but fairly few. So most of the EU Schengen countries, and what the Schengen agreement is that there's no internal border checks, basically, right? So once you're into Italy, once you're into Greece, you're into everywhere. You're into France, you're into Germany, you're into Sweden. It's all the same. And it's just the external borders then that are monitored and that are where you have the checks, and of course in airports and that sort of thing. So there's already this externalization, right, to Greece and to Italy from Germany, let's say, through the EU, and that's done through the Dublin Accords, which you can read about again in the article. Right, what do the Dublin Accords do? That's a good thing to know, because that's the mechanism by which the EU externalizes it. Not the EU externalizes it. It's the mechanism that Germany, Sweden, Britain, maybe France also, these sort of northwestern European countries externalize their migration policy to the east and to the south, because basically what the Dublin Accords do is they say, okay, if you want asylum in the EU, you have to apply in the first member state that you come to. So if the first member state that you come to is almost never Germany, right? If you're traveling by sea, right, by these boats, right, that are coming either from Africa or from Turkey, it's going to be Greece and it's going to be Italy, and it's going to be these islands. It's going to be Malta, it's going to be Lampedusa, right? It's going to be the Aegean Islands that we're talking about here. That's the first part of the member states. And so you've got a chain here, right? You've got, let's say, Sweden and Germany are externalizing, well, let me finish covering the Dublin Accords first. So they say that the first country that you land, that's where you have to apply for asylum. So the first country you land, as we're saying, is Italy and Greece and maybe Spain. So they're the ones who are having to process now all of these asylum applications. And so if you're let's say from Syria, you've come through Turkey, you've crossed the sea, you've landed on a Greek island. Now Greece can't be just a transit country, right? It can't be just, hey, we're in Greece, but we're not staying in Greece. By EU law, you have to, if you're going to claim asylum in the EU at all, you have to claim it in Greece, because that's the first nation state that you came to, the first member state that you came to. So now Greece isn't any longer just a country where they can say, well, they're heading off to Germany. We don't have the resources to help them out, right? To get them established, to help them find somewhere to live and to integrate them to society. That's not what they want from us. They just need to go through, and Germany will figure that out, right? Because Germany's now, through the Dublin Accords, that's on Greece now. That's on Italy now, right? And so Italy and Greece, similarly, right? This is sort of the next half step, maybe more than a step, but at one point now Greece is saying, well, we're going to deal with them on the islands, right? They're going to come to these Aegean Islands, and that's where they're going to stay. We're going to keep them there on those islands, and we're going to build our immigration centers there to detain these asylum seekers. Maybe that's not the right word for it, right? But of course, that's what's happening. Lampedusa, right, on these, so they're not going to reach the mainland, right? They're not going to reach mainland Greece. And then, of course, the next step after that is, well, let's deal with them in Libya, right? And so now Italy gets into the. So I think this started as an answer to like the how would the USA compare to the EU, but it's the externalization that I'm trying to compare here. So is the United States doing the same? And I think you've seen recently moves, although I don't know the details as well as I do in the EU because that's what we're covering, but have moved to the thing to externalize. So we're not waiting for them to turn up at the border, but we're dealing with them. Or asking the Mexican government to deal with them in Mexico. Or like I said, we haven't talked much about the northern border because it doesn't feature very heavily in the immigration discussion in the US. But there is a northern border with Canada, and like I said before, sometimes I've been through customs, US customs in Montreal. That's also equally externalization too. Yeah. And I want to point out, this is not really an answer to any of these questions, really. This is just something that I read in Triandafylidou. Maybe it gets into a little bit about this idea of civil liberties versus rejecting unwanted migrants. One answer, if we're interested in sort of civil liberties, or if we're interested in, this is not quite civil liberties, right? But if we're interested in sort of a nice positive way to look at this externalization, it might be Triandafylidou says, look, the partnerships between Italy and Libya, or Italy and Tunisia, the partnerships, Greece and Turkey doesn't work out so well, probably for all sorts of obvious and historical reasons, but the partnerships between Italy and Libya, and between Italy and Tunisia result in, and between Germany and Turkey actually, or the EU and Turkey, I should say, they result in more development funds, right? They usually come with, what did they give Libya? 5 billion, I think they gave Libya 5 billion to help sort of development funds from Italy in order to help with this problem. I know with the problem of migration, I know Turkey also have received quite a lot of money, right, from the EU to assist in this. So the partnership's working for both the EU member, the nation state that doesn't want to take the migrants, and also for the nation states from which they're coming. And so the idea is, hey, when we find irregular migrants and we want to send them back to you, Libya, will you take them? Oh yeah, but we'll need some help, some development funds to help with that. Okay, here's some money. So there's one benefit for poorer countries, right? Some extra development funds that's flowing from the wealthier northern countries, like the wealthy European countries, to the less the less wealthy Asian or North African countries. So that's one thing. The other thing, of course, is whether you think this is a benefit or not, but often training will come, right? Italian border controls and processes, bureaucracy, bureaucratic advancements, bureaucratic capacities will also sort of efficiencies will be shared with Libyans and with Tunisian governments, right? So those governments will improve their capacity, right, to deal with migrants in their own country. So that's something that, again, Triandafylidou points out as a benefit of this externalization. And I try to sort of answer sort of in an idea of civil liberty, but it's not quite civil liberties, is it? There we go. Oh, this is great. Actually, I should have saved that last answer for here. The second question here that I found, it's 11 upvotes. The externalization of EU migration and asylum policies actually prioritizes control and efficiency over such other policy considerations as respect for fundamental rights. Right? We're in a similar space here. The right to asylum, which is definitely in question here, right? Because now, if you look at international law, I've forgotten the name of the convention now. Oh, I can't think of it. Anyway, definitely, if you look into international law, there is provision in international law for countries to say, look, if you're passing through a safe country, that's where you need to apply for asylum, right? The third safe country does legally, through international law, get you out of having to process asylum claims in your own country if you can say, look, why didn't you, you've, let's say you've made it all the way to Britain, but you've passed through Greece, Italy, France, and then to Britain, right? So if you were in danger and running away from certain death or imprisonment or bad conditions in your country, bad conditions because of this is the basis of an asylum claim, right? Bad conditions based on my political or my racial or my demographic information. If I'm getting away from that, but I've gone through all these other countries first, there is provisions in international law that allows Britain at that point to say, look, it seems more like you're interested particularly in coming here rather than just getting away from the discrimination and the persecution. It's got to be persecution, not just discrimination. The persecution that you're suffering, you're not motivated just to get away from that because you've just passed through all these other countries where you would have been fine. France, right? So there is that provision in international law. But you're right. I mean, in order to claim asylum, you usually in international law have to be able to turn up at the country. And if you can't get to the country, right, because of externalization, you're stuck in Libya now because of some deals and some cooperation that Italy and Libya have. You can never apply for asylum in Italy now. You can't get through. And it's one thing to say that France is a safe third country. But to say Libya is a safe, especially these days, right? Libya is a safe third country, that's a different argument, right? And probably a less valid one, right? So that's absolutely a valid discussion, and hopefully some of those details would help you to write an essay based on this on asylum applications here. But here we go. The part that I got excited about was this: the right to asylum and overall concerns for social inequality between the global north and the global south. So what Triandafylidou is saying is, look, there are some, well, she's saying that, right, because that's a quote from her, but she's also saying in another part of the article, she's saying, look, there is some addressing of social inequality between the global north and the global south because of the benefits that the countries in the global south have when they sign up for these deals, these cooperation, these understanding, partnership of understandings, whatever they're calling them, because they're getting money, they're getting training, they're getting resources. Italian people are going down there and they're helping Libyan authorities identify and deal with, right? And this is a very neutral way, maybe, of saying maybe they're not getting up to very, very much good when they do this, but in dealing with asylum seekers, perhaps, and other migrants that might be headed to Italy, but are right now in Libya. So that might be seen as a benefit to the global south of the technical and financial training and that sort of thing. So the rest of the question goes on like this. This article was published in 2014 with many latest figures being from 2013. Would the author believe that the statement above remains true today, given the rise of right-wing political parties across Europe? Alternative for Deutschland is mentioned, Front National, I think it's just La Front now. La Lega, right, that's discussed in one of our articles, but not here, that prioritizes migration reform led by a nationalist ideology. Yeah, I did read that question before, but now that I'm reading it again, I'm thinking, yeah, I mean, this does seem to be a little bit more, well, and I wonder if the next question that I was going to discuss really, I wonder if this is saying a similar thing or if it's a different thing. Because the question is, what about now? This was 2014, but what about now in 2020? There seems certainly much more of an issue. Certainly by 2014, Alternative for Deutschland definitely existed, and certainly the Front National, La Lega, they were all, by 2014, they were already sort of part of the equation, I think. I would certainly say that. And is it the idea that, hey, listen, there's some democratic justification for the actions of the EU, right? From 2016, right, which occurs after 2014, obviously. You see a large arrival, the arrival of a large number of migrants through through Greece, right, through the Balkans, towards Austria and Germany, and onto Sweden. And certainly the debate about migration intensifies, the political debate intensifies, and even Germany, who were, and this is, I think, capturing the spirit of the question, Germany, who originally welcomed, I think, 1 million migrants from Syria, but also from elsewhere, but the idea was from Syria. They welcomed these migrants, and I think after they had 1 million, there was certainly some teething problems, right, with that, and the reaction by the German population against the policy, and also against other European nations, other members of the EU, Hungary, for example, right, and Poland, where they said, listen, Germany, you're the ones that you wanted to take them. You can, you're wealthy enough and rich enough and socially set up enough to deal with this, but that's not for us. And I think that sort of backlash, which of course Alternative for Deutschland is part of, and we should note that Alternative for Deutschland are certainly becoming more popular, and certainly it is significant and certainly surprising, right, that I don't want to quite say far right, but that a right wing, quite right wing, certainly a nationalist party in Germany is becoming a significant political force. That's certainly remarkable and certainly surprising, at least for my generation, probably for me and my generation. And so, yeah, that I see in terms of the maybe changes since 2014 in attitudes towards migration. And is it now that okay, I see now, externalizing prioritizes control and efficiency over other policy consideration as respect for human rights, the right to asylum. So I suppose what I'm hearing from the question is, look, this externalization of migration, if it does this, it's kind of in harmony with the wishes of the population. And I might be colored by the last question, right, that I was going to cover, which again is quoting the same thing there. How can freedom, order, and equality all apply to this situation? Every human should have a right to seek asylum, but shouldn't every country have a right to freely protect its borders? Who has the right to order in this situation? Order to keep migrants out, or order to allow them in? Why does it apply to? Or who does it apply to? Yeah. Do refugees, migrants' rights outweigh the rights of various countries' citizens who feel threatened? These are tough questions, and I do not see a one-size-fits-all solution, but I'm curious to see if you can make sense of a possible solution that benefits everyone. Yeah. And so absolutely, this is a major issue, and certainly we probably shouldn't see this certainly too much for me, but I think too much for any of us, right? To sort of solve this political question, and maybe I'll go down that route a little bit if you don't mind indulging me. This is a political question, and I think politics. I'm getting into sort of my definition of politics here, so again, bear with me, but don't feel this is probably not exactly where I was imagining going with this, but definition of politics, right, is for me to decide things where really there isn't a strong basis anywhere else. There isn't like an objective basis somewhere to decide this question, right? Between how many migrants should we let in? How should we deal with migrants that want to come? There probably isn't an objective, universal answer there, right? And that's what you're saying, and I certainly agree with that. And because there isn't some sort of objective basis, some sort of best practice or something that's universally applicable, that's been determined maybe by science or something, right? By some sort of universal law of what to do, then it becomes a political question, right? Where those with the power, and that might be democratic power, or it might be other kinds of power, right? Economic power or something, get to make the rules. And I think in that, and that's what politics, I think, for me is, right? It's about the exercise of power, and who and what and who gets to decide what and when, and how do they decide that, and how do they get away with deciding it. That's a lot of what I think about in terms of what politics is. And so I think here when we talk about this. We talk about this migration policy in the EU, and is it who's in charge of it, who's in control of it, and certainly it seems to be not the migrants in this situation, right? They certainly don't seem to have the the power in this situation, or the ability to control that. And I guess it comes down to, like, in the European Union, right? We can look at different countries and say, the different countries have more control over it than other countries. And I think that was a big part of, even if she didn't spend a lot of time talking about it, there was that was the big implication of what Triandafylidou was saying, right? Was where do these decisions get made? Who's dealing with the problem? Who's the boots on the ground? And again, at least at the time she's writing, it's not the sort of Western and Northern European countries, but it's the Southern and the Eastern European countries who are having to make these sorts of decisions, or who are having to sort of figure out how to manage the issue because of the Dublin Accords. And then, of course, moving out from there, right? They don't want to have to deal with it either, and have to, and so it's going out from there. It's been externalized to the islands, and then beyond, right, into Turkey, into Libya, into Tunisia. And so with that, what's the who gets to decide that, and who, and of course, I guess maybe your definition maybe is a little bit more optimistic than mine, perhaps, right? Because yours is not necessarily a definition of politics, right? But maybe it is. It's about how do we solve this solution in a way that benefits everyone, in a way that benefits everyone. And I think that there is an element of that. Absolutely, there's an element of that in Triandafylidou, in this idea of, well, Turkey's getting a lot of money. It's getting a lot of development funds from this, and so is Libya, and so is Tunisia. So it's good for them. It's good for the Italians, because now they don't have to spend their money on they have to spend their resources, maintaining and building and centers and processes and systems for accepting and dealing with asylum claimants, right? And then if it's beneficial in that way for Italy, of course, it's even more beneficial perhaps for the more Western and Northern countries, where it's further and further from their shores. Of course, that all sort of assumes migrants and asylum to be an economic issue, an economic problem, like rather than, well, but then there's the rather than an asset, or rather than a benefit to a country, which seems to be the sort of the common, except for when Germany said, look, this is great for Germany, let's come live here, come migrate to Germany. And so I think there might be a key there in terms of benefiting everybody, right? There might be a key, maybe that's not a solution as such, but it's a if it were the case that, and this would be, again, still politically difficult, right? But if it were the case that members of the EU saw the benefits of migration, but also the benefits of not just migration in general, right? Because of course Britain, for example, even after leaving the EU, they say, oh, no, we see the benefits of we want migrants to come here, we want people from other countries to bring their talents and their entrepreneurship and their intelligence and their wealth, probably, right? We want them to bring it here, right? Absolutely, we want to bring it, but we want to control it, right? We want to decide which migrants to take and which ones not to take. And I think that so then we'd be sort of asking, well, can Britain see, if people want to come here, if people are coming here, whoever it is that they're coming, if they're coming here, this is a great benefit for us. Then, of course, then you've got that mutually beneficial, where migrants come, either economic migrants, right, or people looking for asylum, come to Britain and get away from either the bad economic conditions or the bad political conditions that they're fleeing from, and find hopefully a nicer economy, a nicer political situation in Britain. Then it's beneficial for them, and then of course it's beneficial for Britain. But because, yeah, but I think that's it's sort of a change in attitudes and a change in discourse. But you know, there's no getting over the reality that's certainly not how Europe, especially probably from the last question, right, especially now, is seeing the issue. And you can see that, I guess, from all of the countries, and from the policy of externalization, you can see that, right? This is not accidental policy, right? This is deliberate, right? We're deliberately moving the question of asylum, the question of migration, away from us. And when I say we, I suppose I mean Western European countries, and perhaps North American countries as well, perhaps the United States, as we tried to sort of compare earlier. So, yeah. And certainly in terms of having a right to freely protected borders, I might have mentioned Kant on the other one. That's I spent quite a bit of time with Kant while I was writing my dissertation, which was about it was about hospitality to some degree, right? Hospitality in this sort of sense of international relations, right? What sort of hospitality should we extend? Even, I mean, this is getting a little bit off the topic, but still related to migrants and to refugees. Even when people come, is it better to treat them as part of your society and your culture? Hey, welcome, come on in. You be just like us, live just like us. You know, and not recognize a difference between us and them. You know, between the state that's receiving and the person that's coming in. Is that more hospitable, or is it more hospitable to treat them as a stranger, right? And to say, so that's why I went a little bit with that, and I started to talk about who could be at home and who couldn't be at home, and that sort of thing. But now now that I'm onto that, I've lost a little bit of where I was in here, but maybe we're trying to solve it. And again, I'm going to fall back right on this sort of justification that certainly we're not going to solve any of these issues in the class. We're not going to once and for all have the truth of them, and that's part of I think the appeal for me of the class. But we can investigate and take contributions that political scientists are making to these, and try and I think for me, just use those contributions of political science to look at it in a different way, to try and understand it in either more detail or with slightly different details, and to sort of see things that we couldn't see before. And I think one of the things that this helps me see that I might not have been able to see before is this idea of externalizing migration policy. So I'll leave it there. I hope that was enough of a discussion to really give us some ideas for writing essays on this topic. Again, just a sort of a quick reminder again that we are focusing on the theoretical pieces each week. Also a reminder that the midterm is coming up, and that there will be on that midterm exam, there will be some multiple choice questions like the ones that you've encountered in the quizzes. That'll be half of the grade, and the other half of the grade will be an essay. And these videos are designed with that essay in mind, right? They're designed to sort of draw attention to parts of the readings, to draw attention to specific concepts, right, like externalization. These concepts should be the foundations, should be the starting point for answers in essays. And certainly the readings that we do should be brought in into that. Because again, what I want to do, and I'm going to finish with this, right, sort of reiterating the purpose of the course, is how does political science, what sort of theories exist and what sort of contributions exist from people working in political science that shed light on, help us to understand, help us to see differently, not even help us to understand, help us to see differently from a different perspective, the contemporary issues of the day. So I hope this was somewhat helpful in that, and I will see you again next time, I suppose.